August 25, 1944. Chartres, France, pre-dawn fog over the N10. Diesel hum under gray skies. The sound rolled through the mist like a heartbeat made of iron, hundreds of engines idling, shifting, surging into motion. Trucks stretched so far down the road that horizon and convoy blurred together. Fuel cans rattled, boots crunched over chalk dust, and every breath smelled of oil and fatigue. What began as an improvised line of supply had become something elemental, a living artery of gasoline rations and ammunition feeding Patton's Third Army as it tore eastward across France. German officers watching from the ruins of a railway station laughed at first. They called it a nation of truckers pretending to be soldiers. To them, victory came from maneuver and surprise, not from schedules and manifests. But while their panzers starved for diesel, the Americans built momentum by the ton, 5,000 tons a day, rising with each sunrise. The blacktop pulsed with 6,000 vehicles, 30,000 drivers, and a discipline that ignored sleep and distance alike. Engines never cooled. Lights never went out. One captured major scrawled in his diary, "They fight with fuel, and they have more of it than time itself." That was the revelation the Germans never expected. The Red Ball Express turned logistics into velocity, bureaucracy into blitz. Every truck was a bullet in a new kind of war, one fired not from barrels but from engines that refused to die. The rhythm of pistons replaced the drumbeat of artillery. The color of victory was not khaki or gray, but the black smear of exhaust drifting across a liberated dawn. And beneath that haze, somewhere between dust and steel, the old laughter began to break. Because soon those endless convoys would prove what no tank could, that endurance, not shock, decides the pace of empires. The story of how that happened, how mockery turned to awe, was only beginning to unfold beyond the fog. In the war rooms of occupied France, German generals still believed that victory belonged to the side that struck first, not the side that sustained longest. They viewed logistics as a necessary nuisance, the dull arithmetic behind glory. To the Wehrmacht, mobility meant tanks and columns, not convoys and clipboards. Every major German offensive from Poland to France had begun with the same assumption: supplies will catch up. But now in 1944 they were running headlong into an opponent that had made the opposite assumption, that movement itself was meaningless without fuel to feed it. Before the Allied breakout from Normandy, the German staff at Oberkommando West assessed that American units so dependent on mechanization would bog down after 70 miles. They had charts proving it. Fuel density, vehicle consumption, bridge load limits. The American army, they thought, was too heavy, too bureaucratic, too industrial to keep pace once the front fractured. One colonel sneered, "They drown in their own gasoline." He was half right. The Americans did drown, but in abundance, not scarcity. From the moment the beaches were secured, the U.S. Quartermaster Corps began solving the war backward. Engineers calculated tonnage before battle plans. They laid temporary pipelines along hedgerows and tracked truck availability the way the Germans tracked artillery shells. Every advance had a corresponding fuel curve, a prediction of how long momentum could survive before the tanks ran dry. At first glance, it looked absurd, 30,000 trucks just to move supplies a few hundred miles inland. But behind that absurdity was a kind of cold genius, a machine of distributed rhythm. If one convoy stalled, another absorbed its load. If one depot was bombed, 3 more rerouted within hours. American logistics operated like water. It flowed around obstacles, filled gaps, and carried its own momentum. The Germans, meanwhile, clung to an older religion. They trusted daring, not density. Their logistics were centralized, vulnerable to every bombing raid and bridge collapse. A single broken rail could starve an entire Panzergruppe. Even as their front lines contracted, their supply lines stretched thin, feeding fewer tanks with each passing week. By mid-August, their convoys crawled at 10 miles per hour through shattered villages, half-empty headlights, blacked-out engines sputtering on rationed fuel. Meanwhile, the Red Ball Express roared past at 35. The Germans counted miles. The Americans counted hours. And yet, the cultural divide ran deeper than tactics. The Wehrmacht saw logistics as servitude, a lesser calling for soldiers unfit for combat. The U.S. Army saw it as strategy made flesh. Where German generals dreamed of encirclements and kill zones, the Americans dreamed of timetables, throughput, and redundancy. The difference became fatal once Patton broke through Avranches. His armored spearheads were burning 12 gallons of fuel per mile. German analysts predicted his columns would halt in 3 days. Instead, they accelerated. In that week alone, the Red Ball Express delivered 35,000 tons of fuel rations and ammunition. At the same time, German supply trains reached barely 15% of their intended cargo. A captured report from OB West put it bluntly. Enemy supplies arrive with the punctuality of trains in peacetime Germany. Ours do not arrive at all. It wasn't that the Americans avoided mistakes, they simply learned faster. Where German logistics feared waste, American logistics treated it as margin for error. Their doctrine allowed inefficiency because inefficiency could be absorbed by scale. Every mistake became a metric, not a failure. But to the Germans watching through binoculars, it looked like madness, trucks driving empty, one-way overlapping routes, engines idling at rest stops. They didn't understand that redundancy was the weapon. The U.S. supply system could lose a third of its fleet and still deliver the same tonnage. The German system, designed for precision, collapsed the moment precision failed. The irony deepened at the human level. Many Red Ball drivers were African-American soldiers relegated to labor units by segregation policy. Denied combat roles, they now sustained the very armies that liberated Europe. Working 12-hour shifts, often without headlights, they turned racial injustice into strategic advantage. Their performance was not a miracle, it was necessity executed under duress. From the perspective of the German command, this made the defeat even harder to comprehend. The enemy they had dismissed as mechanical and soulless had found strength in organization diversity and relentless tempo. Each convoy that passed through the fog was a statement. We do not fight your kind of war. By late August, when Patton's tanks reached the Seine, the laughter in German headquarters had turned brittle. Intelligence officers filed nightly reports noting continuous American movement and logistical capacity beyond prediction. The numbers told a new story. Where the Wehrmacht moved by momentum, the Americans moved by math, and the math never slept. As dawn broke over the French countryside, another convoy started its run east. Dust rose from the asphalt, covering the insignia on every hood. Engines rumbled into synchronization, merging into one long, unbroken hum. Somewhere beyond the fog, German officers listened and finally understood that the war they had planned for no longer existed. Because this was not Blitzkrieg reborn. It was something larger. A war where fuel lines replaced rail lines, where discipline beat daring, where the clatter of trucks replaced the roar of tanks. And as that sound rolled across the fields of France, it carried a promise that would echo for decades, that the age of speed had a new master, and its name was logistics. Before the Red Ball Express became legend, it was a disaster on wheels. In the first week of operation, chaos ruled every mile of road between Saint-Lô and Chartres. Trucks collided in the dark engines, overheated fuel drums leaked into ditches. Maps were outdated. Bridges collapsed under untested weight. The U.S. Army had built a machine it barely knew how to drive. Out of 3,000 initial vehicles, nearly a quarter broke down before completing their first run. Some units went missing for days, their cargoes of rations and ammunition vanishing into the fog of confusion. The roads themselves conspired against order. France in 1944 was a maze of narrow lanes, hedgerows tight enough to scrape paint from doors, culverts deep enough to swallow a Jeep whole. Rain turned every slope into grease. Drivers, many teenagers fresh from training depots in Georgia or Texas, learned to steer by instinct rather than rule. Every turn was a gamble between traction and torque. An officer at a field depot near Mortagne wrote bitterly in his journal, "Don't plan the road, build it." And they did. That single phrase became the gospel of adaptation. Military engineers began painting red circles along approved routes, visual markers that cut through linguistic chaos. The red ball symbol meant priority speed and absolute authority of movement. Civilians were barred from the route. Even military police had no power to halt the convoys. What had started as improvisation hardened into doctrine within days, but the price was human. Sleep vanished. Drivers averaged 4 hours of rest in 24, and many survived on black coffee and canned meat eaten from the steering wheel. Convoy leaders carried morphine for the injured and pistols for the desperate. Some died simply by falling asleep mid-turn. Yet the system learned brutally efficiently. Every death, every wrecked truck became data. Mechanics recorded time to failure for spark plugs, brake pads, axles. By the second week, replacement cycles were standardized, downtime cut from 48 to 36 hours. A convoy that once crawled at 20 miles an hour now averaged 35. Where it had once needed maps, it learned rhythm. Patton himself pushed harder than the system could bear. When he demanded fuel for another 60-mile thrust toward the Seine, quartermasters warned of exhaustion. His reply was cold: "My men can't shoot without gas." The order was obeyed. Within 36 hours, the trucks delivered 300,000 gallons, enough to keep an entire armored corps alive. It was reckless, unsustainable, and it worked. From captured German reports, the enemy could not believe what they were seeing. A colonel from Panzergruppe West noted, "They suffer breakdowns yet still advance. We would stop. They multiply." That was the key. The Red Ball Express was not efficient in the classical sense, it was self-healing. Every gap invited another layer of redundancy. When a bridge washed out, engineers built a detour overnight. When tires shredded, depots sent replacements by air. When fuel cans ran short, they were resmelted from captured German barrels. It was messy genius war fought through logistics, not glory. The American system was learning at the speed of necessity. Every broken axle became a lesson. Every lost truck reappeared as a new rule written in grease pencil on the side of another. At night, the roads shimmered with the same hum that had begun the story, diesel engines chanting through the mist. From high above, pilots reported an eerie sight: twin ribbons of light snaking eastward, headlights covered only the faint glow of exhaust, betraying the movement of history. And beneath that rhythm, something deeper was shifting. The men driving these convoys, mostly black soldiers denied combat roles, were becoming the backbone of a new kind of war. They knew the irony: they were fighting for an army that still segregated them, but their success proved what equality could do under pressure. One driver wrote home on a scrap of ration paper, "We move faster than bullets, but nobody sees us." They were seen soon enough. Their efficiency forced even the Germans to acknowledge the invisible. One Wehrmacht intelligence brief from early September read simply, "Enemy sustains armor by automotive relay. Impossible to interdict." The Red Ball Express had become the bloodstream of liberation, but it had paid its tuition in wrecked engines, bent frames, lost lives, and the patience to learn from every mile. By the third week, what had begun as chaos had transformed into choreography. Convoys ran like clockwork, 60 trucks per column, 15 minutes apart, maintenance jeeps trailing every 10 miles. If one vehicle broke down, the rest passed without pause. Keep moving or get left was no slogan. It was survival law. The laughter from German headquarters had faded into the background hum of engines and fear. The Americans had discovered the formula the Germans never mastered: not perfection, but momentum. A system that could fail repeatedly and still function because it refused to stop. And as the convoys rolled through the night, headlights dimmed, engines burning low. One could almost hear the moral of this brutal experiment whispered over the roar of the road: "Don't plan for perfect, plan for endurance." Tomorrow the system would prove its maturity on the battlefield itself, where the hum of trucks would replace the thunder of tanks as the true sound of conquest. September 3rd, 1944. Dawn broke red over the Loire Valley, and the fog smelled of fuel. The convoys had been running non-stop for 2 weeks. Engines never cold, axles turning through rain and mud like the pulse of a mechanical heart. From Saint-Lô to Chartres, from Paris to Verdun, the Red Ball Express now spanned nearly 700 miles, a steel artery, pushing 12,000 tons of fuel rations and ammunition each day. What began as a desperate improvisation had become the rhythm of an army. To the Germans watching from shattered farmhouses, it seemed impossible. They had seen American tanks outrun their supply lines before in Tunisia and Sicily, but this was different. The trucks never stopped. Even at night, their silhouettes flickered across the mist, blacked-out headlights, engines grumbling through exhaustion, a glow of cigarette tips and taillights weaving east. It wasn't heroism. It was tempo. At Patton's headquarters, maps were replaced daily with new arrows. His Third Army was advancing 60 miles faster than Allied planners had predicted. Fuel equals victory, he told his staff, and he wasn't speaking in metaphor. Each Sherman burned a gallon every 2 miles. Each corps needed 500,000 gallons every day, yet the Red Ball delivered it by hand, by sweat, by constant motion. A captured German officer later recalled, "They moved their fuel as we move our guns, endless, tireless, without pause." By contrast, German supply trains were paralyzed. Allied bombers had ripped the rail network to pieces. Horses once more hauled ammunition to the front. A panzer division might have 20 tanks operational on paper, but with no diesel, it was reduced to an immobile fortress. Fuel depots hidden in forests burned nightly under strafing runs. Soldiers drained truck carburetors just to cook their rations. The myth of blitzkrieg, of fast war and flexible supply, was collapsing under arithmetic. Patton's columns crossed the Seine and surged toward the Moselle, with 400,000 gallons of fuel in motion every 24 hours. Every jerrycan was touched by at least 6 hands: dock workers at Cherbourg Depot, sorters, convoy drivers, transfer crews, forward dumps. The network was elastic, self-healing. When one bridge failed, engineers laid a pontoon span before dawn. When mud swallowed an entire convoy, bulldozers carved a detour by noon. And all the while that hum diesel under gray skies echoed across the fields. The Germans tried to counterattack near Montargis, targeting the roads. Luftwaffe scouts reported constant movement of supply columns, but the attacks never connected. Cloud cover camouflage nets and sheer volume made the Red Ball invincible by probability alone. Even when 20 trucks were lost in a single air raid, 200 more filled the gap within hours. At the heart of it all were the drivers, 3 out of 4 of them African American. They drove deuce-and-a-halves through enemy-tainted countryside, unarmed, except for pistols, often sleeping in the cab between runs. They were told their service did not count as combat, yet they lived under constant threat, mines, ambush, exhaustion. Their road discipline bordered on the supernatural: 60 trucks per column, spacing 15 yards, never breaking formation, never stopping. The convoys were so synchronized that pilots mistook them for armored trains. When Patton visited a staging depot near Chartres, he found a line of trucks stretching to the horizon. Dust cloaked every surface. Drivers leaned against fenders, faces gray with fatigue. One saluted and asked, "Sir, how much longer we gotta keep her rolling?" Patton looked down the endless road and said quietly, "Until it ends." And so it did not end. For 82 days, the Red Ball Express fed a war that no longer relied on rails or ports. In that time, it delivered 6.5 million tons of material, a feat unmatched by any army before or since. German observers in captured reports began to change tone from derision to disbelief, from disbelief to resignation. One general scrawled across the margin of a logistics brief, "They fight by mathematics. We fight by memory. We are finished." The sound that haunted them was not artillery, but the constant mechanical rumble rolling through the fog. Every rotation of those engines was a nail in the coffin of an empire built on the myth of precision. The Americans had proven that power lay not in singular brilliance, but in relentless continuity, the ability to turn motion itself into a weapon. By mid-September, German radio intercepts described Patton's advance as liquid movement untraceable. The irony was painful. The Wehrmacht had invented mobile warfare, and now it was being undone by a fleet of trucks. That was the moment the laughter died completely. The Red Ball Express had flipped the axis of war. No longer did tanks define momentum, trucks did. The hum of diesel under gray skies had become the new drumbeat of victory, and across occupied Europe, every general who once mocked the Americans began to understand what they were truly fighting: not an army of men, but an army of motion. By mid-September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become more than a lifeline. It was doctrine in motion. What started as a desperate improvisation now moved with the precision of a rail network. Army engineers no longer spoke of routes, but of arteries. Depot commanders referred to throughput, the way artillerymen spoke of rate of fire. Even Patton, who had once mocked the quartermaster corps as bean counters, began every morning by asking a single question. "How many tons today?" The figures answered him with quiet thunder. Over 12,000 tons of supplies moved daily, double the original projection. Convoys ran on rotating shifts, green circles for northbound, white for return, and the original red marking the priority flow to Patton's spearhead. Each line of paint on a roadside post meant another unit fed, another mile gained. What changed everything was tempo. By the second week of September turnaround time, the interval between pickup and delivery fell from 36 hours to 28. Mechanics had learned to swap engines in the field in under 40 minutes. Fuel dumps could refill a 2.5-ton truck in exactly 3 minutes flat. For an army that once crawled, these seconds became currency. The Germans could not comprehend it. They were still bound by the iron logic of rail schedules printed weeks in advance, fixed loading points, bridges easily bombed. When the Americans shifted from trucks to forward fuel pipelines, the Germans mistook it for retreat. But when reconnaissance planes photographed long hoses snaking up to armored columns, realization dawned too late. A captured report from General Gunther Blumentritt summarized the shock. They move their depots as we move our armies. Their roads are their railways. What made the Red Ball indestructible was its modularity. Every convoy was a unit unto itself: drivers, mechanics, guards, and communications. Loss of one column did not cripple the system. It merely diverted flow to the next. This redundancy made the Americans effectively immune to chaos. Even when a bridge at Mantes-la-Jolie was blown apart, supplies still reached Patton's armor by a hastily constructed pontoon lane before midnight. And through it all, the hum diesel under gray skies grew louder, a constant mechanical hymn across the French plain. Soldiers at rest could tell the time by it. They joked that the Red Ball was the only clock that never stops. Inside each truck, men fought their own war, not of bullets, but of endurance. They drove blind through fog, dodging wreckage and shell fire, sometimes delivering gasoline so volatile it detonated if the brakes overheated. Yet their morale held, fueled by purpose. One sergeant wrote home, "We're the blood in Patton's veins, keep him pumping, and he'll finish this thing." By now, even Eisenhower's headquarters recognized the miracle they had created. Planners began drafting permanent logistics doctrines based on the Convoy model. The British copied it for their own supply routes into Belgium. The Canadians adapted it for the Scheldt offensive. What began as the Red Ball spawned a family of successors: White Ball, Green, Diamond, Blue Stream, each carrying the same principal movement without pause. Meanwhile, the Germans found themselves strangled by arithmetic. Their average convoy moved less than 10 tons per day per truck. The Americans, 10 times that. Luftwaffe officers watching from ruined airfields reported a storm of engines beyond interception. With their fuel gone, their tanks became bunkers. Blitzkrieg, the war of motion, had been outmaneuvered by a war of maintenance. At the height of the campaign, when Patton pushed toward Metz, the Red Ball carried 400,000 gallons of gasoline every 24 hours, enough to move every tank truck and half-track in the Third Army. Drivers joked that they could smell victory in the fumes. When the first Sherman crossed into Lorraine, a lieutenant marked it in his logbook, simply "delivered." Even now, the myth endures that the Red Ball Express was born flawless. In truth, it survived by absorbing its own chaos, the epitome of organized disorder. Its strength lay not in perfection, but in relentless repair. The Germans designed systems that could not fail. The Americans built one that could fail forever and still win. By October, that lesson had reshaped Allied logistics across the continent. Commanders began to see supply not as burden, but as leverage, the invisible front that decided every visible one. The hum of engines replaced the drum of artillery as the heartbeat of progress. In one captured German diary, the handwriting trembles with exhaustion. "We fight men who do not sleep. Their machines sing through the night." That song, that endless diesel hum, marked the inflection of the war. For every road conquered, the Americans built 2 more. For every tank stalled by mud, 3 trucks found a way around it. Momentum itself had changed sides. And from the forests of the Ardennes to the ruined bridges of the Rhine, the message was clear to friend and foe alike. This was not the end of logistics. It was its awakening. The Red Ball Express had turned supply into strategy, and its echo, steady, mechanical, inevitable, would roll eastward until the very last shot was fired. Behind the thunder of Patton's engines lay a quieter revolution, a home front machine so vast that even the soldiers feeding on its output barely grasped its scale. The Red Ball Express was not merely a convoy of trucks in France. It was the final manifestation of an industrial organism that stretched from Detroit to Cherbourg, from the assembly lines of Toledo to the mud tracks of the Moselle. Every spark plug, every can of fuel, every pair of hands behind a steering wheel was part of the same bloodstream, a synchronized act of war production and distribution that no other nation in 1944 could replicate. In the heart of America, factories no longer slept. Plants that once made sedans or farm tractors now produced nothing but motion trucks, tires, axles, and engines. By September, assembly lines had cut retooling time to under 3 weeks. A Chrysler plant could replace its entire production layout in 17 days. Ford's Willow Run, built for bombers, had shifted one wing of its facility to quartermaster trucks. Tires rolled out at 60,000 units a week. Engines shipped by rail in sealed crates, 500 per day. What tied all of it together was interchangeability. Every part from a truck's fuel filter to its spark plug fit every other vehicle in the convoy. Standardization turned complexity into simplicity, a weapon as sharp as any rifle. German officers who studied it later called it industrial tactics, the ability to win not by invention, but by repetition perfected. A German prisoner of war, once a logistics officer at OB West, described it with disbelief. Their factories fight with them. They do not stop when the guns begin. On the European side, that rhythm translated into a miracle of recovery. Trucks crippled by mines or wear were cannibalized and rebuilt within 24 hours. A damaged axle in the morning meant a repaired truck by nightfall. Mechanics had memorized repair sequences like soldiers memorized firing drills. The American maintenance depots, tented cities of grease sparks and humming generators, became factories on foreign soil. Every convoy that departed was reborn from the wreckage of another. Engines were swapped in 40 minutes, transmissions in under an hour. The junkyards outside Le Mans turned into gold mines of salvage, feeding a self-sustaining loop. If one supply line snapped, 3 others grew to replace it. The Germans had a word for it, Selbstheilung, self-healing, but they had never managed to achieve it. Back home, the human machine matched the mechanical one. Training centers like Camp Holabird in Maryland and Camp Ellis in Illinois produced 1,200 new drivers a week. Instructors hammered one lesson into every recruit: endurance beats elegance. Drivers learned to change a clutch by feel repair carburetors in the dark and read a road by the vibration under their palms. Within a month, they were shipped across the Atlantic to take the wheel in a convoy that never stopped. Most of those men were African-American soldiers serving under segregated command members of quartermaster truck companies that history once called non-combatants. Yet they carried the front on their backs. They learned faster than anyone improvising on the road when manuals failed, trading spare parts like currency and keeping engines alive with ingenuity alone. A corporal named Henry Red Glenn wrote in his letter home, "We fix her drive, her feed her, and she never quits. Maybe that's the war, just keep it from quitting." That was the secret the Wehrmacht never cracked. The American war machine wasn't elegant, it was resilient. It could afford to break 1,000 trucks because it could build 2,000 more. For every shipment lost to weather or shelling, 10 replacements were already at sea. For every driver fallen asleep at the wheel, 3 trainees were crossing the Atlantic to take his place. Loss for the United States had ceased to mean depletion. It meant circulation. In late October, when heavy rains turned the French roads into rivers of mud, the convoys did not stop. Bulldozers widened shoulders. Engineers laid crushed stone through the night. Drivers chained their wheels and drove blind, guided only by the glow of exhausts ahead. The rhythm held. Fuel deliveries dipped by less than 5%, a number that seemed supernatural to the German analysts watching from across the Rhine. In the archives of Panzergruppe West, a final entry recorded the moment with bitter clarity. Their strength lies not in men or steel, but in process. They have made war a craft of industry. By now, the system had become self-aware. Officers spoke of pipeline time and swap latency, the way generals spoke of artillery ranges. Maintenance became doctrine. Efficiency became faith. The American soldier who once marched now moved with a gearbox under his command, an industrial infantry whose weapon was the machine itself. As the autumn fog settled over Europe, the diesel hum under gray skies no longer belonged to one convoy. It was the sound of an entire civilization in motion. Assembly lines, convoys, depots, training camps, all pulsing to one heartbeat. The Germans had built their war on genius and precision. The Americans built theirs on rhythm and endurance. And that rhythm, endless and indifferent, was now unstoppable. The Red Ball Express was no longer just the artery of Patton's army. It was the pulse of modern warfare itself, the proof that victory could be manufactured, taught, replaced, and multiplied. It was the dawn of the logistics age, and its first note was the growl of engines rolling through the rain. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the roads of France still bore the scars of the Red Ball Express. Grooves from endless convoys carved permanent paths into the soil. Ghost highways of victory. Farmers plowed around them for years afterward, saying the earth still smelled like gasoline. But to the soldiers who had lived inside that roar of diesel and dust, the end felt strangely quiet. The hum that had carried them across a continent faded into memory, yet its rhythm would outlast the war itself. Patton's Third Army credited its momentum not only to bravery, but to fuel delivered with the punctuality of sunrise. In post-war analyses, German staff officers could only shake their heads. They had never understood how an army could move faster than its supply lines, until they saw the Americans turn supply into movement. The Red Ball Express had rewritten the logic of warfare. No longer would logistics follow strategy. Logistics was strategy. Across Europe, remnants of that highway became living monuments. In La Queue-les-Yvelines, a single road sign still bears the red circle that once marked the convoy route, a silent reminder of the drivers who never came home. Memorials in Normandy and Reims honor their service, many of them African-American soldiers who built the bridge between endurance and equality. They were men denied medals and headlines, but not history. In 1992, surviving drivers gathered once more in uniform, gray-haired, stooped, standing beside the rusted hull of a deuce and a half, and the French villagers applauded until they wept. Their legacy reached far beyond the battlefield. The logistics doctrines written from the Red Ball experience became the blueprint for every Allied supply chain that followed from Korea to the Persian Gulf. The U.S. interstate highway system, conceived a decade later, borrowed both its structure and its spirit from the convoy maps of 1944. The rhythm of trucks on asphalt, the pulse of refueling stations, the logic of interchangeable parts, all were children of that furious, improvised experiment in motion. Historians would later call it the victory of systems. Soldiers called it something simpler, the road that never quit. For every wrecked truck now rusting in the fields of France, there are 1,000 engines echoing its purpose in the arteries of modern logistics. The Red Ball Express proved that endurance could defeat genius, that process could outlive power. And so, as dusk falls over those same French roads today, a single hum still lingers in the air, the echo of engines rolling under gray skies. Not the sound of war anymore, but of what war had built, a new age where speed and supply march together, and where even silence remembers the rhythm that once carried freedom east.